Hi, everybody. It's 12:30, so we'll get started very soon. I'm just going to wait another 2 or 3 minutes to see if anybody else wants to join us, and then we'll get going. Okay, everybody, let's get going. So welcome, everybody. It's great to have you all here today. I'm Susanna Gray. I'm the president of the San Francisco Bay Area ISOC chapter. And we've teamed up with Chris Mondini and Joe Catapano from ICANN again to give you an overview of some of the key policy discussions and activities that took place at the recent ICANN 61 meeting. So I'll give a very brief introduction about the San Francisco Bay Area chapter for those who are new to us, and then Chris and Joe will dive right into to the meat of the webinar. Next slide, please. Can everybody hear me okay? Is the volume all right?
We can hear you, Susanna.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. So the Internet Society is a global organization whose mission it is to work towards an internet that's open, globally connected, and secure. There are around 100,000 individual members, and they are members of around 112 chapters worldwide. The chapters are generally aligned with the Internet Society's mission, but they operate autonomously. Excuse me. And so the San Francisco Bay Area chapter is a 501c3 organization founded in 2009. We have around 2,100 individual members at the moment. We're operated and overseen by a volunteer board of directors, some of whom are on the call today. And we are funded by sponsorships, donations, and partnerships. While our focus is mainly on the Bay Area, we are the only chapter in California, so we do try to keep the entire state in mind when we're doing our work. We're also the closest chapter to the Pacific Northwest, so we try to keep our eyes on the key issues in those areas too. Okay, so we have several areas of focus, including the rural-urban digital divide, access for all, diversity and women in ICT, internet governance, privacy and security, and IoT. And our main activities revolve around information dissemination, outreach and education. We also support projects that are aligned with the chapter's mission, which is basically that we believe the internet is for everybody. We're also heavily involved with the work of ICANN, and we help to represent end users' interests as an affiliated member of NORELO, which is the North American Regional at-large organization. And so if you would like to join us and get involved with our work or support our work, please do consider joining the chapter. You can join as an individual or as an organization. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me directly or go to our website and take a look at the information on there. So that's about it. And I guess now over to Joe.
Thanks, Susanna. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. At the onset, I'd just like to say that we'll hold the questions till the end of the presentation, but we'll be monitoring the chat, so you can post your questions in there, and we'll take note of them and answer them at the end. Or you, once we get to the Q&A portion at the end, you can raise your hand in the room, and we'll answer that way. So great to have you all with us. I believe this is the third time we're doing this type of readout session with the chapter, so we're very happy to do it. Once again, I'm Joe Catapano. I'm the manager for stakeholder engagement for the North America region, and I sit in the Washington, D.C. office of ICANN. And before we dive into the ins and outs of the ICANN 61 meeting in San Juan, for anybody who is new to the organization, we're just going to go a quick overview of who we are and what we do. So ICANN is a global organization whose mission is to help ensure a stable, secure, and unified internet. We coordinate the unique identifiers that make up the backbone of the internet, the domain names, protocol addresses, and protocol parameters. And each address is unique, so computers know where to find each other, and we are the ones that support those identifiers. We were formed in 1998 as a not-for-profit public benefit corporation. We're headquartered in Los Angeles, California, but we have offices around the world. The ICANN ecosystem is made up of three parts. There is the ICANN organization, which is the more than 300 staff members around the world, that's of which I'm a member of. There is the ICANN Board of Directors, which is a 16-member board chosen by the community. And then there is the most important part of the ecosystem, which is the ICANN community itself, which is a completely volunteer collection of stakeholders from various sectors, including business, technical communities, civil society, governments, academia. And they work together in a multi-stakeholder bottom-up policymaking process to give advice and make policy at ICANN, and they do that through the various supporting organizations and advisory committees at ICANN. Here's a look at the policy development process at ICANN, just so you have an idea of how things work. So on the left-hand side, you have our supporting organizations named there that develop the policy. And at the bottom of the slide, you'll see the advisory committees that advise the board on the policy being developed. So you'll see they'll identify an issue, working groups will be formed, people will initiate a policy development process, and the working groups on conference calls and email lists mostly will develop the policy and move it along. And they will occasionally meet in person at our ICANN meetings, which is one of which we'll talk about in this webinar. And you'll see there are opportunities for public comments on ICANN policy throughout the process, and anybody can comment on a policy. You don't need to have a special membership or anything. All of the public comments are posted on our website, and people participate there. And eventually, once the policy is developed, the board on it, and then it is implemented once it's ratified. Here is a look at ICANN 61. It is one of our 3 public meetings a year. This was the community forum, and it was a 6-day meeting focused on outreach, capacity building, and showcasing our work to a broader audience. And what we're going to run here is some of our more the headline developments, the highlights of the meeting. It's not totally comprehensive. It was a very large meeting, lots of questions. Here's a look at some of the numbers. We have more than 1,500 participants, more than 600 from North America. 36% of attendees were participating for the first time, which is always great to see. As I said, we had a lot of sessions, more than 300. And there's a look at some of our more technical information, platform views, and how much data was transferred. You can see it's quite a large operation for those 6 days. And now I think we'll go into the content of the meeting. So I will turn it over to my colleague, Chris Mondini.
Hey, Joe. Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Susanna. I'm Chris Mondini. I am responsible for stakeholder engagement. I sit in the Washington office. I'm delighted to have this group to share some highlights from our meeting last month. It took place in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and you just heard Joe talk about the magnitude of the meeting and the scope of it, and it was really quite inspiring to see how the Puerto Rican hosts and the convention center were able to accommodate us all. It was the first big international gathering there since they had a hurricane just over 7 months ago. So in that setting, we set about working on some of the issues that you've come to know and associate with ICANN, which, for example, one is domain names. And if you're familiar with what's called the new gTLD program, that's new generic top-level domains, which is a program that greatly expanded the number of domain names that we think of, at least this part of the world, the right of the dot. So the 22 generic names like .com or .edu now are over 1,200 such examples like .samsung or .bmw or .guru or .xyz. If some of you may already registering web names under these extensions, these generic top-level domains. As you can imagine, this expansion came with a need to protect the rights of people who are trademark holders. And so there are a number of what are called rights protection mechanisms. So if you are a company that wants to have vigilance over whether people are using or misusing your trademarks, those mechanisms include a trademark clearinghouse database where you can register your marks and be alerted if people try to use them in registering web names, and various dispute resolution mechanisms. One of them is called the Uniform Rapid Suspension, and that's a rights protection mechanism that's supposed to provide rapid relief to the trademark holder in the cases where infringement is really clear-cut. You can go and study and look at all of the cases under this dispute resolution mechanism and see where rights holders have been able to correct and reverse abuses. For example, IBM, somebody registered IBM.guru, and the IBM Corporation did not want somebody registering IBM.guru. There are other cases. Somebody registered CNNHeadlineNews.com, and CNN was able to rectify that using this dispute procedure because that was an unauthorized use of their trademark. There are groups, a working group in particular that is under the generic name supporting organization that makes gTLD policy that is looking at the effectiveness of these dispute mechanisms, and they issued a report really a call for data to find out what parameters would be used to evaluate the effectiveness of that particular dispute resolution process. So if you work in the area of trademarks or rights protections, it may be something you'd be very interested in.
Okay.
I'm going to ask Joe to do the next section before jumping back in on the next topical area.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So one of the hot topics at the meeting was ICANN's finances and budget. And it was broken up into two main sections, one of which is the new generic top-level domain auction proceeds. So for this, where there were multiple applicants for the same gTLD and they were unable to reach an agreement, there is a last resort auction that is held to resolve the dilemma. And the proceeds from those auctions go into an escrow account that will then need to be, and the money sits there, and then the community will decide ultimately what ICANN should do with it. And so that's the impetus for a lot of these conversations at different ICANN meetings. The working groups have been going on for over a year now, looking into what should be done and having conversations on how to allocate the money. And there are differing viewpoints from depending on what section of the ICANN community you speak to. And their cross-community working group heard reactions from their board liaisons and talked to external experts about some of the mechanisms that are being considered by the working group for the distribution of the proceeds. So continuing the process, more to come at ICANN 62 and beyond, but it was a topic of conversation. The budget for ICANN was another hot topic throughout the meeting. So one of ICANN's new accountability mechanisms that's been in place for the past year and change, year and a half or so, is the ICANN community's ability to review and approve the budget of the organization. And the fiscal year 2019 operating plan and budget was put out by the organization for public comment by the community. And the comments were accumulated up until just before ICANN 61. So it's about the beginning or middle of March. And at the meeting, the organization and the board talked with community leaders to take a look at what are the key drivers of cost and where can things be made more efficient, both at the ICANN meetings and just in general. How can we make the most effective use of the funds, both the community and the organization working together. So some of the suggestions that were made were to, we have at ICANN, we have a number of organizational reviews of our different initiatives and programs. So there was a talk about staggering those reviews over a longer period of time, or phasing in mandated organizational reviews to ease budget and workload. And I'm sure we could talk more about the budget. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions toward the Q&A. And one of the things mentioned was that the organization will supply a paper outlining of cost-saving options. And we have a blog here from our president and CEO that you can view to learn more. We'll send the slides out to everybody after the presentation, so you can follow these links and get more information. And with that, I will turn it back to Chris.
So there were some issues that related to the, in addition to things like the ICANN budget that Joe has just discussed, there were other discussions about ICANN's governance and accountability. And the one of which is the nearing completion, one of the working groups that's working on ICANN accountability. This group had its origins in that IANA transition that we referenced, which was 18 months ago. And while the contract with the US government did end, there were a number of additional areas for strengthening ICANN's governance and accountability and transparency that were identified. and the community has been working to make those recommendations a reality. And so the cross-community working group, which by cross-community means it includes representatives of all the different supporting organizations and advisory committees and others, they came up with recommendations on a number of issues. And the issues were things like the diversity of participation in ICANN, the jurisdiction of where ICANN has contracts and pays contracts, how the Office of the Ombudsman works, how accountable the staff is, and so forth. I would say the hot button or the most interesting issues were these issues of jurisdiction and also the issue of human rights. On the one hand, the jurisdiction really focused on ICANN being truly global and being able to pay bills in different currencies and conclude contracts or have arbitration of contracts in different venues around the world. And there were a number of recommendations there for that. And then in human rights, there was a placeholder bylaw that was put in place at the time of the transition away from US government stewardship that said that ICANN should observe universally agreed human rights principles in its work within the scope of its mission. And so there's now what's called a framework of interpretation, which answers the question, well, how, when we compare ICANN's work and mission to agreed upon human rights principles, where is the overlap? So for those of you that are interested in those issues, there are some links, and I find it very interesting for people that are new to ICANN, the discussion of how domain names and internet addresses might affect or be affected by human rights issues is a pretty rich topic of conversation. We've also, I mentioned there are several supporting organizations and advisory committees that Joe enumerated earlier, and we've called out one, the Governmental Advisory Committee, to highlight some of its activities. And that's not to show any favoritism, of course, because our favorite is the At-Large Advisory Committee, as everybody here on the call knows. That's a joke. That's a multi-stakeholder joke. But the Governmental Advisory Committee is usually of interest because the whole topic of how governments interact with the multi-stakeholder model is one that's also usually of interest to our more diverse and broad audiences. Just to highlight a few of the things, you can read the GAC, as we call it, their communique, and on the next slide, there's a link to that. But just to call out a couple of the issues. One is the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, and we have addressed that in a slide or two ahead, so I won't dwell on it here, but you may know that it's a European Union regulation to protect data of Europeans and people doing business with Europeans, and personal data, things like phone numbers or email addresses. And there are some concerns because there's a system that is known as WHOIS, which is a way for web registration information to be accessible that has information like that available. And so the governments clearly have an interest in discussing and debating, and they gave some advice to ICANN at the time of the meeting, and the transcripts are at the link. The human rights and international law, they had an update from that working group that I mentioned before on that framework of interpretation that I mentioned before about how does ICANN's work overlap with human rights, because as you can imagine, the governments of the world, and we now have over 170 of them who are members of the GAC, have an interest in that topic. In fact, Honduras has just told us yesterday that they will join the GAC as well. So it's quite a collection of governments with interest in internet and internet addressing issues. On that note, they also have some ongoing concerns about two-character country and territory codes. And I suspect that many of you know that two-letter codes are used by countries. They're actually come out of the International Standards Organization, but they're codes like FR for France or UK for United Kingdom or CA for Canada. And you might know them also as country code domain addresses, top-level domains, so .fr or .uk or .ca. But governments also, some have expressed concerns about how these two-letter codes might be used before the dot at what's called the second level. So if you have a UK.BMW, might not cause too much heartburn, and it may be actually something BMW is planning to do. And if it's even CA.sex for Canada.sex, it would be interesting to see if a country like Canada would care one way or the other. But there are plenty of countries around the world that you can think of that might not want to be affiliated with a .sex top-level domain. And there is a wide variety of opinions of the countries in terms of how they would like to be notified, how they would like to have an opportunity to comment or prohibit or ban or approve. And so there's ongoing advice that comes from the Governmental Advisory Committee on this issue. And again, it's one of those that relates to the concerns of governments and how they navigate in the multi-stakeholder model to voice those concerns. I mentioned that there were some, the General Data Protection Regulation, and we've put that under the legal and technical category. And so I suspect there may be questions on this, or if those of you are already following ICANN casually, you will see that there's been a lot of communication around it. In fact, our CEO and members of our executive team have been in Brussels speaking with European data privacy officials to address the issues that I explained briefly. So this General Data Protection Regulation will go into effect on May 25th, and it has really strict rules about the handling or processing or using of data that relates to EU residents, particularly their personal data. And if you have ever registered a domain name, you've worked probably with a registrar who has provided that service to you. And that registrar in turn works with the registry that helps maintain that information within the top level domain. So if you bought a .com address through a registrar like GoDaddy, GoDaddy took information from you about administrative information and contacts and IP, where you are and your location on the internet. And VeriSign, which operates .com, similarly has even more robust information. And this information is made available, and ICANN, the organization which has contracts with registrars and registries, asks that this information be maintained, really stemming from the history of the early days of the internet. If you can imagine in the early days when it was a group of academics who knew each other and really just needed to be able to get in touch with each other if somehow the traffic wasn't flowing properly. Yeah, this really actually is now a great global distributed database, but at the early days was a notebook which would list universities, the key contact or the professor in the computer department, their phone number, and the earlier versions of IP addresses. And so that was the very first incidence of something known as Whois, which is something that's available to everybody now to look up in cases where they want to know who is behind a particular website, the contact information. And now as the internet has been commercialized and become global, many other people use that particular Whois service. Certainly public safety and law enforcement look into it if they find that crime is being conducted on the internet. Cybersecurity and researchers and firms look into that data to stop attacks or to locate the source of them. And the intellectual property community, which is looking for things like where counterfeits may be coming from or where piracy or bootleg videos and things may be being trafficked on the internet. All of these groups have an interest in having access to that registration data. So their interests are coming into conflict with the European officials' efforts to keep personal data private. And so it falls really to the registries and registrars to navigate whether they abide by ICANN contracts that require that they continue to make available some of this data, or if they're doing business in Europe or with Europeans, if they comply with the European law. There's very stringent penalties if you break this law. It can be many millions of euros, up to 4% of your annual revenue, in fact. So for registries and registrars, it's a very tough situation. And then for ICANN itself, which has stakeholders that range from privacy advocates to business users of the internet, to cybersecurity practitioners, to registries and registrars, we have sought to bring a really balanced sort of dialogue with the European Union to ask guidance for a way forward. Now, there's a proposed interim model, and at the links, and literally this is changing almost daily, but you can follow the links or the blogs to navigate to a page which will give you the updates. There's a proposed interim model which offers a way to hide some of the data, the personal data, and yet give accreditation or a pass that allows people like people investigating crimes, law enforcement, and others to have some access to the data. And working out the timeline for putting a proposal like that together and the details of how it works is going to require a considerable amount of time, and probably, well, definitely more time than is between now and the deadline. The GDPR is relevant for EU citizens not residing in the EU, and it is relevant for any company outside of the European Union that has EU citizens using its services. So it's quite broad. In any event, this is kind of a case where obviously if you're a data protection professional in Brussels, you may not even have been aware of who is, you may not know how ICANN or the domain name system works, and so it's a very rapid and steep learning curve for them to understand this exception, which is a little bit in the category of unintended consequences. I think that the next topic we'll just, I'll just mention what it is. We wanted to have a technical content in this webinar. If any of you are on the more technical side of our stakeholder spectrum, there's a security, domain name security extension system which makes the domain name system safer and mitigates man-in-the-middle cyber attacks, if you know what those are. Basically, people spoofing you to think that they're the website you're seeking when really they're not the website you're seeking. And that's in place for a number of registries and operators. And the baseline encryption for that is being updated for the first time ever. It's referred to on this slide. And if you're interested in those topics, I encourage you to follow the links on this slide, and you'll find out more about the plan for this rollover of the global, sort of like the password for the whole internet, if you really want to exaggerate it. It's at least the password for the secured domain name system. So that's my 10 minutes. And next we will have a look at ICANN 61.
Yeah, these are just some pictures from Puerto Rico. Good time had by all. You see some members of the organization and our board, as well as members of the community, including a couple of our members from the North America Regional at-large organization, Noralo. One of our global indigenous ambassadors is a photo on the bottom left there. So yeah, and then now with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Susanna for a quick update from the Nominating Committee and a little bit about the Fellowship and Next Gen programs at ICANN.
Hi. Yes. So I don't really have much of an update from the nominating committee because the representative, one of the representatives on the nominating committee, Leah Semica, who is an advisor to the San Francisco Bay Area chapter board, could not attend this call, unfortunately. But I will just read out this quick update that she gave to me. So just for those of you who don't know, the nominating committee is responsible for filling, is it 3 seats, Joe? On the board, on the ICANN board?
6 seats.
6 seats, oh yeah. So the NomCom is responsible for filling 6 seats on the ICANN board. And they are currently now in the process of doing interviews of the applicants. So they received a total of 109 applications, and that's broken down as 19 from Africa, 25 from Asia Pacific, 21 from Europe, 13 from Latin America and the Caribbean, 31 from North America, and of those, 33 were female and 76 male. They recently held a 3-day meeting in Washington, D.C. To review all these applications and made a first cut of 37. And those 37 people are being interviewed in the next few weeks. And I believe that the final cut of those 37 will be interviewed in person at the next ICANN meeting, which is taking place in Panama. And it is at that meeting a decision will be announced which candidates they will choose for those 6 seats. And you can read the announcement and get some more information at the link there on the slide. And then it's me again. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ICANN Fellowship. Next slide. So there are 3 programs available to help newcomers get a grip on ICANN. One of them is the Fellowship, which I will talk about in a second. One of them is the Next Gen program, which is a regionally based program that creates awareness for young, well, I would say, yeah, younger members of the community. I think the age limit there is up to 28, 29. And it's mainly for people who are still affiliated with universities. I don't know much about the newcomer program, so Joe, do you want to step in there and talk about that very quickly?
Sure. So the newcomer program is a self-learning platform provided by ICANN where folks can self-educate. So we have something called ICANN Learn that has a lot of courses on ICANN and internet governance up there. It's at learn.icann.org. And it helps newcomers navigate the remote participation for ICANN meetings and things of that nature. So it's completely online, the newcomer program, as opposed to the fellowship, and the Next Gen is funding for in-person interaction at ICANN.
Thanks, Joe. Glenn, I've just seen your comment. We will provide a link in the chat to the NomCom page you mentioned. Okay, so I'll do that in a second. Excuse me. So I was lucky enough to be chosen as a fellow for the ICANN 60 meeting in Abu Dhabi. So I'm just going to give a really quick run through of how the program works. It's a really good way for newcomers to get involved in ICANN, although I have to say it does enhance your experience of the fellowship program if you already have a vague idea about how ICANN operates and the kind of work that it does. Otherwise, you'll probably be drowning in so-called acronym soup for a week. and not really getting a good grip of what's going on. And due to geographical restrictions, the program has only been open to those of us residing in North America since 2016. But more and more people from the region are now taking advantage now that they're eligible. So if that's something you're interested in, you're able to apply now, because before 2016, people in North America were actually not able to take part in the fellowship program. So essentially, the fellowship program offers a fast-track program of community engagement and gives an in-depth overview of the role of each supporting organization and advisory council. It helps kind of prepare you and educate you on how to contribute to policy development. And it also helps you find the right community to join, because there's many ways of being involved in ICANN, and you can't possibly be involved in them all. So you kind of have to narrow your focus and decide which part is more relevant to you and your work. So fellows also receive flights to and from the meeting. They get their hotel accommodation covered, and they also receive a small stipend. So it's a pretty comprehensive program. And the next meeting takes place in Panama from the 25th to the 28th of June, but the application round has already closed for that one. So the next meeting, oh, sorry, back to that slide. Yeah, so the next meeting that you could possibly apply for will be the ICANN 63 meeting that's taking place in Barcelona, Spain, in October 2018. That's open to everybody, because some of the meetings are only open to fellows who have already been a fellow in the past. So they have a little bit of background knowledge and are able to participate better in the meeting. I think that only applies to the policy meetings. Yeah, so if you're interested in that, get your application in by April the 29th. So with the fellowship program, I think the one thing that really summed it up for me is that, you know, the kind of catchphrase that we use, which is, when you're a fellow, there are no stupid questions. And it's a fantastic opportunity for people to really directly question community leaders, to question the board, and even to, you know, say what you think to the CEO, Goran Marby, and question them about the work of ICANN, and not be judged for your question or judged on the content of what you're saying. Goran even holds an open ask me anything kind of style session with the fellows, which I believe really shows a level of support that he has for this program in particular. So I'm not sure if the Global Indigenous Ambassadors Program is still running, but if it is, there was something that I thought was quite successful. So the Global Indigenous Ambassadors Program tries to ensure community representation from some of the world's most marginalized communities. And the ambassadors actually follow the same program as the fellows. I think it was a pilot program, but it seems to have been quite successful, and I'm wondering if it's going to be continued. But maybe that's something that you have more information on, Chris.
Yeah, just for now, it was just for ICANN 60 and 61. So they're.
But Glenn is saying that it's been requested to become core.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the end of my section on the fellowship. If anybody has any questions about that, please reach out to me directly. I'm happy to talk anybody through how the fellowship works.
Great. So our next meeting, as Susanna said, is in Panama City. It's ICANN 62. It will be from June 25th through the 28th. This is our policy forum, so it's a shorter meeting, very focused on policy development and getting the working groups and teams together for in-person development for policy and working very hard on advancing policy. So it'll have a little bit less of the bells and whistles that some of the other ICANN meetings have. So there are no public forums. There's no opening ceremony. It's really just the nitty-gritty of the work. We hope you can join us. You don't actually need to be at the meeting in order to participate in an ICANN meeting. We have remote participation options available, and there is the Panama City website you'll see is there, and you'll be able to navigate. The schedule will be up soon, and there'll be more information on remote participation. There's also a link for you to sign up for our mailing lists and newsletters there. And I think that brings us to Q&A.
Thanks, Joe. One of the reasons we try to do these readout sessions is to be able to have an informal opportunity to meet with people who have interest in the issues or just interest in learning more about ICANN. And so I want to thank Susanna and the ISOC San Francisco Bay Area chapter again, and for all of the others, some on this call that helped put these together, and certainly Joe and Susanna. Thanks for getting the group together. We have time for conversation, questions, comments, or anything that might be of interest to the group.
Jeff Blomberg here. I just wanted to verify that the slides will be shared. I think the chat box
Yes.
has been filled with little bits and pieces.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Slides and
Yeah.
recording.
Okay, great. And some of these links I'd like to explore and kind of refresh my memory a bit.
I have a quick question. If nobody else has anything, maybe it's handy for people to know, aside from the fellowship program, what newcomers can do, or people who are already involved with ICANN but want to get more involved. What can people do to help them get more involved in ICANN?
So you mean, what could people do apart from becoming a fellow if they're interested in becoming involved?
Exactly, because the fellowship program is not available or appropriate for everybody. So what else can people do if they want to get involved in ICANN's work?
Well, so as we keep referring to the multi-stakeholder model, and broadly speaking, the stakeholder categories range from technical to governmental to business to civil society and end users. And so depending on where you sit in that array of stakeholder categories can influence the groups that you might begin to affiliate yourselves with. The easiest is, I think, at large. And so talking to people like you or Glenn McKnight about how individual memberships in an at-large structure, or NORALO, the North America Regional At-Large Organization, you'll begin to have insights into the issues of ICANN and have more access to these kind of broader updates. But if you know already, for example, that you're a business user with an e-commerce business, or if you're a cybersecurity practitioner or academic, or you're interested in the domain name business, those might affect other places where you might align yourself. So the supporting organization that works on domain name policies, it has a constituency for intellectual property attorneys. It has a constituency for ISPs and network operators, and it has one constituency group, stakeholder groups for both those businesses that buy and sell domain names, but also those that are businesses that simply rely on the internet. And each of them, to a very large extent, is always very interested in recruiting and attracting new members. They conduct a lot of outreach, generally around the ICANN meeting, but also to join them, if you're a business, it can be it depends where you are in the world. If you're, it's a nominal fee to join these. In some parts of the world, the fees are not that nominal, and there are allowances made for that. But if you know already that you're interested in pursuing your business interests and having a safer, more consumer-friendly internet, and because you have an e-commerce business, I would say look at the business constituency, talk to a member there, even join, because then you get on their mailing list and you see the topics and the issues that are under discussion. I'm also going to make a really big push in the coming months that people sign up for our newsletters and our regular, any regular updates. There are some links on the last slide in this presentation where people can do that. Again, just to keep abreast of the topics under discussion. The other, if you're part of a business association or even a university, you might try to get interest on behalf of the group to help follow ICANN for you. So I guess it's a very long-winded answer, but I'm happy to talk with anybody individually and help steer them toward members of the community or those that are doing the outreach that will help you with a little bit more of a guided onboarding. There is a day-long newcomer program for every ICANN meeting, and that can be also followed remotely. So you could even sign up for a newcomer day and sit in that and get a much longer explanation of what I've just tried to answer here.
Thanks, Chris. That was really helpful.
And as certainly as anybody has any experiences or reaches any roadblocks or, what Susanna said about the fellowship program, there are no stupid questions. And as far as I'm concerned, any question that shows interest in ICANN is a really welcome question. And so any of us that you know on the call would be happy to help guide anybody who has an interest in becoming more involved. Efforts like this webinar also are designed to help people. If you're a returning visitor to this webinar now, you've had a couple of opportunities to hear about the issues, so that also we hope is helping ease the onboarding process if you decide to become more engaged.
Thank you. This has been very useful.
Thank you. Is there anything else, Susanna, that you'd like to add from the point of view of the chapter?
Only that it's just really useful, I think, for us to do these readouts. I think it's a great thing to have a kind of condensed overview of what happened at the previous meeting, and I hope we can do more in the future. This is the third one now, and I'm very pleased with how they're going, so would look forward to doing more.
Great. All right. Well,
so yeah, I guess if nobody has any more questions, I will email the links to the slides and the recording to all the participants as soon as they're ready. And I guess that's the end of this webinar. And thanks very much, Chris and Joe, and everybody for attending.
Thank you.
thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Okay, bye.